So this is the first of our second batch of 3 snippets for this week. A reminder that this is our only week where we have the 2 groups of snippets, but I figured to start things off, and because the schedule was so odd, this was the best way to go. So the 3 snippets for this week are going to be looking at the early progressive era, basically the run-up to World War I. So that's the Theodore Roosevelt presidency, 1901 to 1909, and then the Taft presidency, 1909 to 1913. But this particular step is to look at the altered international environment in which the U.S. under Roosevelt was operating. The kind of baseline for the early progressive era is that the U.S. becomes more active in international affairs, although World War I is going to be the tipping point here. So first of all, this is the ethnic map of Europe in the 19th century. And if you sort of look at it, you don't have to look at it particularly closely. You can see in Western Europe and in Scandinavia, basically you have ethnically homogeneous countries with the exception of Belgium. But in Eastern Europe, you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, down to the Middle East, and here in the Balkans and in Southeastern Europe, these ethnic tensions. And this is an era of nationalism, and so the eastern part of the continent is a quite unstable continent. The key country here is Germany, which is unified in a series of wars in the mid part of the 19th century and becomes a unified empire in 1871 after a war in which it defeats the French. And for 20 years thereafter, Germany operates under a system which is developed by its chancellor. So it's a monarchy, but the chancellor is sort of the political head of things. Otto von Bismarck, who basically says, look, France is our enemy. We've conquered some of French territory. Our goal has to be to isolate the French. So what we're going to do is to create an alliance with Austria-Hungary and with Italy. We're going to reassure the Russians in a treaty called the Reinsurance Treaty that we're not interested in invading Russia. Basically, it's a kind of mutual non-aggression treaty. And we'll also make clear to the British that we are not a threat to them, and we'll do that, Bismarck says, by Germany not pursuing colonies. This is an era where the British start to expand into colonial empire in East Asia, in Africa. Germany wants to make clear to the British that they're not a threat. And similarly, Germany doesn't build up its navy under Bismarck, and Britain is primarily a naval country. So Bismarck is trying to provide a number of different ways to reassure the British, whether it's that we're not going to attack Russia, we're not going to build a large navy, we're not going to have significant colonies, to sort of reassure the British that Germany is not a threat. We want to ensure that, from the German standpoint, that France has no allies. And this is a remarkably successful policy for 20 years. The problem is that the Kaiser dies in 1890. He's replaced by his son, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm the son wants to have Germany play a more expansive role. He gets rid of Bismarck and no longer adopts the policy that Germany should basically be more or less peaceful with every country in Europe except for France. And instead, between 1895 and 1914, 2 networks of alliances begin to develop in Europe. One, the Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the second, the Triple Entente, which is a later forming alliance between France, Great Britain, and Russia. And you don't have to be a strategic genius to figure out how this network of alliances is worse for Germany than what Bismarck created. In the Bismarck world, Germany has only an enemy to its west, France. In the Wilhelm II world, Germany has an enemy to its west, France, but a potential enemy to its east, also Russia. And in response to this, the Germans develop a document called the Schlieffen Plan. Put it in the back of your mind because we'll be coming back to it next week, by which they'll defeat their enemies on 2 sides. And the theory here is that Germany will attack through Belgium, a country that is newly created in 1830. It's supposed to be, its neutrality is guaranteed by everyone. Germany says, we don't care about this. So the plan is to attack France through Belgium, surprise the French, quickly eliminate the French from any war. You see the quote from the Schlieffen Plan here down at the bottom, and then shift all of Germany's troops east to Russia, because the correct assumption is that it will take Russia longer to mobilize. So the basic thrust here is that Germany, as we go from Bismarck to Wilhelm II, moves from a very safety-oriented and cautious strategic vision to a very reckless one, and that's going to help set the stage for World War I. And that's this is the environment in which things are developing. One big problem for Germany in this arrangement, this triple alliance. Italy is not a particularly reliable country in strategic affairs, and the Germans sense not unreasonably that Italy might defect, which is exactly what happens in World War I. The key alliance for Germany is Austria-Hungary, but Austria-Hungary at the turn of the 20th century it's a multi-ethnic empire. Sometimes called the dual monarchy, even though the real power is still in the Austrian section of the country. Hungary technically is a kind of autonomous unit within the empire. You see all of these different ethnic units within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the Germans, who are really the dominant ethnicity, but the Czechs and the Slovaks, we have Poles, we have Ukrainians, Hungarians, Romanians, Slovenians, Croatians, Bosnians. It's the ultimate of these multi-ethnic countries, and in an environment where there's an increased emphasis on nationalism, this idea that every national identity should have their own country. Austria-Hungary is a country that's in some ways on its last legs, and so Germany relying so heavily on Austria-Hungary compounds the problem of this alliance system. Now, it's not just in Austria-Hungary that we see these ethnic divisions. It's also here in Southeastern Europe. Now, this was a part of Europe that was ruled by the Ottoman Empire for the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century, but the Ottomans start to decline in power in the 18th and 19th centuries, and gradually these newly created countries in Southeastern Europe, small, weak, ethnically polyglot countries emerge. The first is Romania, then Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece. The Ottomans maintain a small portion of Europe. They'll do so until the second decade of the 20th century, when Albania will become independent. But the problem here is that we have this kind of unstable section of Europe. And again, this is another thing to keep in the back of your mind, because it will play a major role in the run-up to World War I. All that said, Germany again has embarked on this reckless set of strategic decisions. Germany is also the major industrial power, population center of continental Europe itself. So you look at this chart. This is it traces the comparison between the German population and the French population over basically 2 generations, from 1871 until 1914. And what you see here is that Germany's population just explodes in this 40-year period. France's population just barely increases. And so from the French standpoint, there's this fear of Germany as a power that is a rising power. The greater the population, the more potential soldiers you can have. So France has this sense that it's a kind of beleaguered situation. And so too are the British. The British are worried about Germany's Wilhelm II's decision to reverse the early Bismarck policy and to build up a navy. So Britain starts to build up a navy in the early expand its navy in the early 20th century. This is what's called a naval arms race. So Germany builds a new vessel, and then the British build a new vessel, and it's not a healthy environment. And the British, also looking to sort of outflank the Germans, look for allies in other parts of the world. They reach out to the Japanese. They set up an alliance with the Japanese called the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, which originates in 1902. And Japan, which had been largely isolated diplomatically until the middle part of the 19th century, rapidly militarizes in the early 20th century. And in this war called the Russo-Japanese War, Japan takes over Korea, which previously had been under the control of the Chinese, and becomes the dominant power in Manchuria, even though China technically still runs things in Manchuria. So the basic thrust here is that the U.S., as we move into the Roosevelt presidency, is confronting a world that is changing in ways that are frankly quite troublesome. It's becoming a more unstable environment. We have these rising powers: Germany, Japan, to a certain extent, the UK. We have these declining powers: France and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. The Russians have, on paper, a lot of potential power, but are not a particularly well-run nation under the Tsar. And this is the environment in which Roosevelt is going to insert the United States. And so our second snippet will take a look at that.